is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The first evacuees from a steel factory in Mariupol have arrived in Ukrainian territory, but many more are still trapped.
This is Ukraine's finest hour.
Boris Johnson becomes the first Western leader to address Ukraine's parliament. He announces $375 million in military aid.
The European Union prepares fresh sanctions on Russia, but divisions remain over an oil embargo.
Profits at the energy giant BP more than double in the first 3 months of this year, along with growing calls for a windfall tax.
And Biden hits back at the Supreme Court following a leaked report suggesting millions of women could lose their right to abortion.
The first evacuees from the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol have arrived in Ukrainian territory after a perilous journey out of the city.
Buses of civilians were greeted by aid workers in the town of Zaporizhia. Mariupol's mayor says hundreds more people remain trapped at the plant, with Russia resuming its bombardment.
Well, let's talk now to John Gambrell of the Associated Press in Lviv. John, what do we know about the health of these people who've been evacuated, who've arrived in Ukrainian territory?
It's over 100 people, and most of them are walking, they're talking, they seem to be physically okay. There was at least one person who was described as having broken bones by the Red Cross. There were other people with minor injuries, but Red Cross insisted that they weren't critical injuries. They described living underground for days, even weeks, as the Russian bombardment of that steel mill continued. They're out in safety, but now the real question remains on what's going to happen with the rest of these evacuations. The UN and the Red Cross were only able to get in because the Ukrainians and the Russians had made an agreement to stop firing there. But immediately after this evacuation, we understand that Russia had begun firing again on the plant. They said that the fighters inside had moved into offensive positions. The fighters inside have told the Associated Press that Russia now appears to be striking it with airstrikes as well as moving in to storm the facility, which raises questions about what's going to happen to those remaining inside.
And the second bombing in Odessa in as many days, do we know any more about that?
Ukraine and Russia are telling two different stories about what's been going on in Odessa lately. Overnight, we had this strike that happened that targeted a dormitory, according to Ukrainian officials. They say it killed a 15-year-old boy. This morning, the Russian Defense Ministry countered and said that they targeted an airfield somewhere in the Odessa region that they said had a warehouse full of foreign weaponry, drones, missiles, and other equipment that they destroyed. These two different accounts couldn't initially be sorted out by the AP, but it comes as Russia is increasingly targeting Odessa. We've seen one bridge, and you can hear the air raid sirens start right now behind me. That's been happening at least one other time today in Lviv, as air raid sirens have been going all day in Odessa as well. They've been targeting in Odessa a bridge at least 3 times, as well as that city's airport, destroying a runway there.
John, feel free to go at any time, but in the remaining moments, let me ask you about President Zelensky, who's made a fresh appeal to another European Parliament.
Yes, that's right. He spoke today to the Albanian Parliament. This was via remote, as he's done with all these other addresses that he's done to people as wide as the Japanese Diet to the U.S. Congress. Zelensky was really hitting on the idea that Russia needs to be locked out of the international financial system. He reiterated that ports should shut themselves to Russian boats, and he also even said that Russian tourists shouldn't be allowed to come into countries because, as he put it, you don't know if you're dealing with a killer or a hangman with those coming in. Zelensky also made a fresh appeal for increased sanctions by the EU on Russia. Let's listen to what he had to say.
When the EU discusses the sixth package of sanctions against Russia, together we must insist on having an oil embargo as a part of that, as well as a serious blockade of any schemes that Russia uses to cheat the free world and ignore the sanctions. The Russian banks must be fully expelled from the international financial system.
Yeah, so as we have this right now with him just making these comments, the European Union is meeting in Brussels. They're discussing what to do with Russia after it decided to turn off natural gas supplies to both Poland and Bulgaria last week.
John, thanks for that. John Gambrell of the Associated Press in Lviv.
Britain's Prime Minister has pledged his support for Ukraine in the first ever address by a Western leader to the country's parliament.
Boris Johnson said he would fortify Ukraine until no one will ever dare attack again, and he set out a new multi-million-dollar package of military funding. Our correspondent Naweed Jabarkal reports.
For millions of Ukrainians, one world leader is being seen as a champion of their cause. Boris Johnson visited Kiev last month, designed as a show of support. On Tuesday, he addressed Ukraine's parliament in a speech that echoed the words of Winston Churchill, his predecessor during the Second World War.
This is Ukraine's finest hour, that will be remembered and recounted for generations to come. Your children and your grandchildren will say that Ukrainians taught the world that the brute force of an aggressor counts for nothing against the moral force of a people determined to be free.
Johnson took aim at Russia's actions throughout his speech, and President Vladimir Putin in particular. He said the outcome of the war was one of good versus evil and right versus wrong. Aside from the rhetoric, there was the promise of more weapons. Within weeks, the UK will send more missiles to target ships and anti-aircraft systems. And Johnson announced $375 million in new military funding, including radars and drones.
We will carry on supplying Ukraine, alongside your other friends, with weapons, with funding and humanitarian aid, until we have achieved our long-term goal, which must be so to fortify Ukraine that no one will ever dare attack you again.
The promise of more arms was warmly received in Kiev, the standing ovation led by President Zelensky, who struck a close relationship with Johnson in recent months. Russia will be watching too, conscious of the heavier weaponry being supplied to Ukraine since Moscow started this war in late February. Since then, more than 11 million people have fled their homes. If it is the existential battle Boris Johnson's predicting, there could be a lot more suffering still to come. Naweed Jabarkal, CGTN, London.
Finland and Sweden could be edging closer to NATO membership. Interest in joining the alliance has grown significantly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Their prime ministers are both in Berlin for talks with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray, who is in Berlin for us. Trent, how have the discussions gone, and just how close are Finland and Sweden to membership?
Well, Robin, I think certainly the direction of travel and the mood music that we are seeing from those two countries is that really an announcement on NATO membership could be imminent. Certainly when they spoke to reporters today, flanked by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, they made repeated comments about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine had changed the security situation in Europe. In the words of the Swedish Prime Minister, it is a game changer for both sides. If they were to join, it is an extraordinary turn of events. Both sides have resisted calls to join NATO really for decades. And if you look at recent polling just in Finland, to give you a flavour, around 62% of Finns now say they would like to join NATO. That is up from just 21% back in 2017. So you can clearly see the calculus is changing. Let's just have a listen to the Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin, as she spoke about the rationale and the justification for why her country would like to join.
Russia's attack on Ukraine has changed our security environment completely. There is no going back. We see now more clearly where Russia wants to take us. It is a world of spheres of influence where the stronger has the last word.
Now, it's important to note that neither side has made a firm decision, well, not one that they have announced publicly, but we do have a couple of key dates to watch out for, namely May 16th, according to the Swedish Prime Minister, where they will release a white paper deciding what they'd like to do. In the words of the Swedish PM, they say no options are off the table, including joining NATO. For what it's worth, Chancellor Olaf Scholz said today, from a German perspective, if the two sides want to join NATO, they will get the full support here in Germany.
And signs that Germany's Chancellor is changing his cautious approach towards Russian energy sanctions. What can you tell us?
Yeah, much like Sweden and Finland inching their way towards possible NATO membership, we are sort of seeing Germany inch away backwards from Russian energy. Of course, Germany has been one of the most outspoken opponents within the EU against an energy embargo. That is because they are worried about the impact it could have on the economy here. About 50% of Russian gas, about 50% of gas imports to Germany, I should say, come from Russia. So any immediate cut-off would have a dramatic impact. But on oil, there are signs that the country is beginning to make preparations for that embargo. We heard from Robert Habeck, Olaf Scholz's economy minister. He said that earlier in the year, about 33% of oil imports were coming from Russia. He says they've now managed to get that down to 12%. He says that is a level the country could therefore manage if there was an oil embargo. But of course, all eyes are on Brussels to see whether there will be an EU agreement on those types of energy embargoes.
Trent Murray in Berlin, thank you very much.
Well, the European Commission is preparing a sixth round of economic sanctions against Russia, including a possible embargo on buying Russian oil. But several member countries say they'll oppose a full ban. Let's talk to our correspondent Rebecca Bunden in Brussels. Rebecca, realistically, is there really likely to be a full oil embargo?
Well, it's expected that there's going to be an oil embargo as part of this next package of sanctions imposed by the EU, but there are questions about what the timeline will be and will some countries be exempt from it, because there has been division over this. Countries, including particularly Hungary, have expressed their disapproval. They've said that they would veto any energy sanctions on Russia. That's because of their dependence on crude from Russia. They're very concerned about that. So this raises the question that the EU could actually look at phasing out gradually across the year, over the year, that this could be a ban that comes into effect only by the end of the year, or some countries like Hungary and Slovakia could be exempt because of their dependence. We'll only see that when we see the final proposal and agreement actually coming through. Germany, which had opposed an oil embargo, has now done a U-turn on that, has said it would be on board, but indicated that having more time to actually put in place alternatives, other systems, would be very welcome, that it's important that countries are fully prepared. But at this point in time, the EU really wants to look at cutting off revenues to Russia, and a lot of those revenues are coming from energy supplies, energy sales, to actually limit Russia's funding of its war with Ukraine.
OK, well, we've talked about oil. What else can we expect from this latest round of economic sanctions, and when is it likely to be announced?
There had been some expectations that we could see the proposal by the European Commission for the sixth package of that sanctions actually coming through today. Now there's talk of potentially this happening tomorrow. We're certainly expecting the European Commission to propose these sanctions within the next few days. Now, as well as that oil embargo, what we could also see, there's been talk that we could also see some more Russian banks actually being cut off from the SWIFT payment system as the EU really looks to try to cut off vital revenues to Russia. And also there's been concern, of course, about the impact this will have on on European countries as well, that yes, Russia will be affected, but at the same time there is going to be economic pain, particularly in terms of inflation, energy prices rising. Inflation's already a big problem, and then there'll certainly be economic fallout for EU countries as well, which is what many of them are concerned about.
Rebecca, thanks for that. Rebecca Bunton, our correspondent in Brussels.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Russian roulette. President Putin signs a new decree on banning exports to the West as the sanctions row escalates on both sides.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
This is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
US President Joe Biden says he'll step in to protect what he called fundamental abortion rights. It follows revelations from a leaked document that the Supreme Court is poised to overturn the legal right to abortion established in the case of Roe v. Wade in 1973. There have been protests in Washington by both pro- and anti-abortion groups.
If the rationale of the decision as released were to be sustained, a whole range of rights are in question, a whole range of rights. And the idea we're letting the states make those decisions, localities make those decisions, would be a fundamental shift in what we've done. So it goes far beyond, in my view, if it becomes a law and if what is written is what remains. It goes far beyond the concern of whether or not there is the right to choose.
Well, CGTN's correspondent Caroline Malone is outside the US Supreme Court in Washington. Caroline, the US's highest court then looking to overturn the right to abortion. It's an extraordinary turn of events.
It certainly is, and as you heard from President Biden there, he's certainly not happy about it. And a large number of the people who've gathered in crowds outside the Supreme Court here today, about 200 people at the moment, they're certainly not happy about it as well. They support abortion, they support women's rights on the whole, from the posters and the flags that we've been seeing down here. But as for the Supreme Court itself, it's actually come out in the last hour and made a statement and said that this is an authentic document. However, it is a draft document, so it's not a final decision. But it's a betrayal, they're calling it. The Chief Justice Roberts has actually called for an investigation to find out how this document was leaked in the first place. And certainly it's pretty unusual for this type of document to be leaked and then published in the press in the United States. So it's a big deal in that sense as well. As for what was in the document, well, it talks about Roe versus Wade, which was the decision in 1973 to give a constitutional right for abortion in the United States. It's talking about trying to overturn that and release that, which would essentially mean that it's much harder to get abortions in the United States. But that decision is not a final one. It's just a draft document. It was dated February. So plenty could have happened in that time to change things. I will say, though, that there is a Conservative majority on the Supreme Court right now. Justices lean more 6-3 in the Conservative favour. And so it is likely that when we do hear a final ruling, they could, in fact, lift Roe versus Wade and change things pretty strongly in the United States. It doesn't necessarily reflect public opinion, though. I mean, there's a study that came out last year from a reputable organisation that shows that something like 59% of people in the United States actually do support abortion. A good proportion of people don't, largely, so it's certainly a divisive and split issue. But as you say, the President of the United States has already come out and said it is important to protect women's rights, a fundamental right.
So what has prompted the Supreme Court into potentially revising this 1973 ruling now?
Well, members of the Supreme Court are considering a case at the moment, and it has to do with the state of Mississippi. Mississippi has come out and banned abortion from 15 weeks onwards, so they're trying to make a very strong ruling there. There's been appeals, and that's reached the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is due to make a decision on that case later this year, in a month or two, June or July. We're likely to hear that final decision. And that's what this draft document relates to. So certainly opinions could change, but we could have a final decision on that in a month or two in particular. And at the same time, we're going to be probably hearing a lot of protests from people because it is such a divisive issue. Crowds gathering here today, and we're also hearing that the women's movement, the Women's Rights March, is going to be having in a couple of hours' time bigger protests, not just in Washington, D.C., but across the country. So we are likely to hear more from that side of the story later on in the day. I mean, the ruling itself, though, if it does come through in June or July and lift Roe versus Wade, it could really fundamentally change things in the United States. What it means is it puts the pressure then back on individual states to make a ruling on abortion, to decide individually if they allow it or not. And at the moment, there could potentially be as many as half of the states in the United States that do decide to ban abortion. And that, of course, could really change the lives of many people, not least the women who live in those states.
Caroline, thanks very much. Our correspondent Caroline Malone in Washington.
The British energy company BP has recorded its highest quarterly earnings in over a decade, helped by soaring oil and gas prices. Profits more than doubled to $6.2 billion for the first 3 months of this year. It's prompted renewed calls for a one-off windfall tax on energy companies to help UK households grappling with rising bills. Well, Professor Nick Butler is the former Group Vice President of Strategy and Policy Development at BP and also a former advisor to the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. Nick Butler, welcome. Will anyone in your old company be uncomfortable with this, or is this just the acceptable face of capitalism?
No, I don't think they're uncomfortable. I think what is uncomfortable in today's results is the write-down of the Russian assets that they had, as BP withdrew just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And they've now taken everything off the books, and that's a loss of about $24 billion that they've had to... They did the right thing, but there's a price. On the revenue, I think it's what you would expect, given high oil and gas prices around the world. Those prices have not always been high, so these are rather exceptional earnings. And the question is what they do with the money. Will they invest it? And they are saying today that they're going to invest it in a mixture of oil and gas because the world still needs that. Here in the UK, 80% of our energy consumption is down to oil and gas. But they're also investing, and actually investing more in the UK, in renewables, in low-carbon energy. And so I think their position will be that they know how to use the money. If the government wants to take some of it, that is the government's decision here. But that will reduce the amount that they have to invest in new sources of energy, which I think are needed for energy security in the future.
Well, the opposition in the UK is calling for a windfall tax. What possible grounds, given these profits, are there now to refuse? Italy is increasing its taxes on energy companies, I think, from 10% to 25%. The UK government is saying that there won't be a windfall tax.
Well, first of all, you have to realise that the tax system in the UK is progressive because they're making more money, and we'll see the same from Shell, I think, later this week. They will pay more tax anyway, so they're not getting away scot-free. I think the real point, though, is what you do with the money. You can't get energy security unless people invest in new developments. They take time, they take resources, and that is what BP and other companies do for a living. We need that now. There's going to be a shortage if we cut off Russian supplies across Europe. in other parts of the world. So it's up to the big companies to invest in the energy that we all need for the future.
Householders watching this who are struggling to pay their bills, particularly pensioners on perhaps fixed incomes, would say they need government intervention here. What are the solutions, if not a windfall tax?
Well, I'm not an expert on the welfare system. I think that a lot of money is wasted in big projects in the UK government that could be redirected to these immediate needs. I think that would be a better way of doing it. I mean, I think HS2 and really silly projects like that should be put on the back burner, and the government should, instead of wasting money, put the money back into the pockets of the people who really need it.
Professor Nick Butler in London, thank you very much for talking to us.
Pleasure.
Car maker Stellantis has agreed to buy the car-sharing joint business Share Now from BMW and Mercedes-Benz. It marks the end of a 13-year loss-making venture for the two German brands. The deal is reported to be worth about $105 million and would bring more than 3.4 million customers to Stellantis' existing car-sharing division. P&O Ferries is restarting its cross-channel passenger services between Dover in England and Calais in France for the first time since it controversially sacked hundreds of employees with no notice. The British operator's move to cut at least 800 jobs last month and hire cheaper agency staff came under fire from the British government and sparked union protests. The company is owned by a Dubai-based logistics group. The US bank Citigroup is taking responsibility for the so-called flash crash, which hit several European stock markets on Monday. Citi says one of its traders made a mistake inputting a transaction, leading to trading being suspended on the Swedish market, amongst others. Flash crashes are market glitches caused by human error. The Federal Reserve is widely expected to raise interest rates by 0.5 percentage point on Wednesday, the largest hike in over 2 decades, as the US battles inflation. Further increases are expected to follow later in the year as the central bank looks to reduce its $9 trillion balance sheet. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. So, John, the Fed starts its 2-day meeting today.
Hey, guys. Yes. Hi, Robin. Hi, Jamie. I was just laughing to myself there about the flash crash story, because we had one here about 10 years ago, and I was sitting at home on a day off, and the desk phoned me, and they said the Dow's down 1,000 points, and no one knows why. So I rushed in, and it turned out that it was what they call a fat finger. So somebody hit 2 keys at once. We're not entirely sure that's what the true outcome was, but we think it was like a fat finger. Very frightening indeed when it happens. Anyway, so yes, the Federal Reserve, we're kind of treading water here this morning, waiting for this decision. The Federal Reserve, the FOMC, the committee is meeting now. They will come up with a decision at 18 hours GMT on Wednesday, tomorrow, and we are almost certain it will be a 50 basis point increase in US interest rates, bringing the rate to 75 basis points at the moment, just under 1%. And I think there could be another 50 basis points when they meet again in the middle of June. And at any point, either tomorrow or in June, it could be a 75 basis point increase, moving the overnight Fed funds rate significantly higher, but still way down on where it has been in history. There's a report today here that says the Fed needs to get inflation to 4% if it's to avoid the R word in 2023 or 2024. Inflation is really eating into buying power here now at corporate level, but also at the mom and pop level as well. When you go to the store at the weekends, you really do notice the food increases, and that's really worrying Wall Street. They're very concerned about the increase in food prices. So the rate hikes hopefully will cool all of that. It's a bit complicated, but basically if borrowing costs more, and it costs more for the individual on the auto loans and some house loans and some other bank loans that they have, and of course it costs corporations a lot more. The idea is that they'll think twice about expanding and spending, and then it'll have a knock-on effect all the way down the economy, reducing prices. But you don't want to go too far. It's a very delicate balancing act. And because of that, yesterday, Monday, and indeed today, Tuesday, we have a big rally going on Wall Street. We had a huge rally at the end of the session, a big turnaround. Dow was down about 500 points. It closed up about 80 points in the end. Dow is now up 1/3 of 1%. Nasdaq's only just in the green. S&P 500 ahead by 0.5%. Oil at $104 a barrel seems to be going up no matter what they do. And the 10-year interest rate is at 3%, and that's the one, just under 3%, and that's the one that always negatively affects technology stocks. Just on this subject, let me just quickly leave you with this thought. Mike Wilson works at Morgan Stanley. He called the 1987 crash. He says the S&P could tumble by 3,400 points if a true growth crisis occurs, and that will put the S&P 500 at 780 points from where it is now, 4,180. Let's hope he's wrong, guys.
Yes, indeed. And while we wait for this Fed decision, Pfizer and Amazon are hitting the headlines instead.
Yes. Well, just quickly, we did this on our programme yesterday. In the end, Amazon didn't get a second union vote at that much smaller warehouse on Staten Island, one of the 5 boroughs in New York. The big one last month did vote in favour of a union, but this far smaller one, they counted them all yesterday, and the answer was no. Now, of course, recriminations are going on. The union side is saying, we want an inquiry into what happened. And Amazon, of course, is challenging that big union vote from earlier this month. Other stories of the day, Pfizer, the drug company, revenue up 77%. You know why, because we're all taking their vaccine. Avis, the car rental company, they've got record profits, and the reason is twofold. One is demand, but the other is they've been flogging off their car fleet quietly because people want to buy the cars so much. I mean, I wouldn't want to buy a former rental car, but there you go. And later today, in a couple of hours' time, Airbnb, world's biggest travel agency, gives us its latest earnings. Shares down 6% going in. Guys.
We will no doubt be talking about that tomorrow. John Terrett in New York, many thanks.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, bunker mentality. Why buying a nuclear shelter is all the rage in the United States.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The first evacuees from a steel factory in Mariupol have arrived in Ukrainian territory, but many more are still trapped.
Our other headlines: Boris Johnson becomes the first Western leader to address Ukraine's parliament, describing Kyiv's resistance as its finest hour.
And the European Union prepares fresh sanctions on Russia, but divisions remain over an oil embargo.
Tit-for-tat economic sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine have intensified. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree paving the way for further economic sanctions against the West.
They're likely to be imposed on the export of Russian goods and raw materials.
Well, let's speak now to our correspondent in Riga, Will Denslow. Will, what more do we know about this decree?
Well, Jamie, the message from Russian President Vladimir Putin is that these steps being taken against because of unfriendly actions from unfriendly entities as well as nations. Now, we don't know exactly who is included in this latest round of Russian sanctions, but we believe that over the next 10 days, a list will be compiled. So we'll have more in the coming days as that information is released. What we do know is that it will essentially block the ability to export goods as well as raw materials to those nations that are included in this latest sanctions list. This, of course, comes as the European Union is preparing another tranche, the 6th round of sanctions against Russia, this time, of course, including, it's likely, those critical blocking of oil coming from Moscow as well. Very significant indeed as far as the European Union is concerned. It also comes as the United States, according to President Joe Biden, is making moves to seize Russian assets, including essentially goods belonging to oligarchs. That has prompted, as you might imagine, a very strong message from the Kremlin saying that that sets a dangerous precedent.
The diplomatic dialogue goes on. France's President Emmanuel Macron has been speaking to Russia's President Putin.
That's absolutely right. It's a phone conversation that's believed to have lasted about 2 hours, Jamie, and according to the RIA news agency, Vladimir Putin urged once again for Ukraine's allies to stop supporting them, to stop supplying them with weaponry. The message from Vladimir Putin, according to this phone call, is that he accuses Kyiv of committing war crimes, and he says that essentially these weapons being sent from Ukraine's allies are aiding Ukraine doing that and conducting those kinds of attacks in contravention with human rights, essentially. There was also a message from Vladimir Putin accusing Kyiv of being the ones that aren't taking peace talks that, of course, are going on a pretty much daily basis remotely, of not taking them seriously. We also know that a key issue of the global food crisis, which has been really fueled by this conflict, was brought up by Emmanuel Macron as well, considering the fact that Ukraine and Russia alone contribute to around 30% of the global supply of wheat.
Meanwhile, there's been no climb down from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in his rather undiplomatic dispute with Israel.
Undiplomatic is absolutely right, Jamie. Of course, for context, Russia has reiterated time and time again that denazification is one of their key policies as to why they are in Ukraine. This, of course, comes despite the fact that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is himself Jewish and lost family during the Holocaust. Now, in an interview recently, Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, Russia's top diplomat, stated that Hitler was Jewish. So those remarks, those that say that there can't be Nazis in Ukraine, essentially means nothing. He also said that some of the biggest anti-Semites have been Jewish. Now, the message from Israel's foreign minister is he's demanded an apology. Russia's ambassador was called for meetings in Israel because of it. Since then, though, we've had an escalation. Sergei Lavrov stating that Israel is supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So a very strong message again there from Sergei Lavrov, certainly doubling down on his remarks. Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, has accused Sergei Lavrov of either forgetting his World War II history or perhaps not knowing it in the first place.
Will, thanks for that. Will Denslow, our correspondent in Riga.
Chris Bellamy is a military analyst and historian specializing in Russian security and defense. I asked him how sanctions are influencing Russia's military campaign in Ukraine.
For the Ukrainians, this is very positive news, and it's improving their morale, which is clearly because they're fighting for their lives and their country, which is already very high. So that's the immediate effect. In terms of the sanctions and their effect on Russia, I don't think they're affecting Russia directly in terms of the tactics and operations in Ukraine, and not yet. This will be a longer-term effect. One of the important things which we've already noticed is the non-availability of Western tech like chips and things that are important for high-tech Russian weapon systems, digital systems. And this, for example, has delayed the manufacture and deployment of new Russian tanks, which we haven't seen. We haven't seen the T-14, which is an upgraded version of the T-90, because that's more sophisticated and requires some foreign components, and the T-95, which is even more advanced, which is a robot turret, so there's no people in the turret. I won't say unmanned, because of course the Russians do have women soldiers fighting as well. And the turret's the most vulnerable bit. So the T-95 is a revolutionary new tank, a truly revolutionary one, but it's not in service yet. Instead, the Russians are using relatively conventional systems which have been in service for years.
So that's Russia. Of course, Ukraine has been getting help from NATO with its weapons, hasn't it? What have been the key places where NATO has helped?
Well, the NATO and Britain in particular sent the absolutely critical things, which are anti-tank and the new generation light anti-tank weapon, which is made in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and the Starstreak anti-air missiles, which have shot down Russian helicopters. So those are the sort of systems that the Ukrainians needed most, and they've got them. Where the problem comes and where we enter potentially a dangerous grey zone is where it's proposed to send Ukraine long-range, large-caliber artillery and possibly fighter planes. And these cross into the area where the Russians could claim that they are being used offensively.
Well, the war in Ukraine is having far-reaching consequences all around the world. In the United States, fears of an escalation are leading to a rise in demand for nuclear shelters. As our correspondent Tony Waterman now reports from Texas, it's a case of history repeating itself.
Inside this 5,600 square meter warehouse in Murchison, Texas, there's a manufacturing boom underway. Workers here, the beneficiaries of a conflict raging 9,600 kilometers away. These men aren't building weapons, but emergency bunkers that will eventually be buried deep underground, a secure shelter from almost anything that transpires up above.
This is how we finish it out here in the factory before we take it out in the field and deliver it.
Gary Lynch is the general manager at Rising S Company, one of America's top builders of doomsday bunkers. He says orders have flooded in since the conflict in Ukraine began in February. In a period when he would have sold about 6 shelters,
take a look under here.
He says he sold 35. And while sales in the past were mainly driven by fears of an economic collapse, many of his new clients are voicing one major concern.
It seems like this time around is because of a nuclear event. I'm getting people to call that have never even thought about a bunker. You know, maybe even people that never even realized that they even existed.
Russia has the world's largest nuclear force. The U.S. is the second largest. The fear of such weapons has been flowing since the conflict began.
The surveys that I've done.
But Michael Mills of the University of Kent, whose research centers on doomsday prepping, says it's rarely just one trigger that pushes people to such extremes.
Most people who undertake prepping can really name 8 to 10 scenarios, perhaps upwards, of things that they might be concerned about, which actually makes it quite harder to judge whether it is justified or not.
Americans have been down this road before, most notably during the Cold War.
Well, folks, I'm glad you could come down to see my fallout shelter.
When the government encouraged Americans to build their own fallout shelters. Today, the nature of preparedness is different, Mills says, often a reflection of distrust in government, which makes it difficult for leaders to calm nerves. It also doesn't help, he says, that the conflict is playing out in real time on social media, making a battle on another continent feel incredibly close.
Those images of war-torn Ukraine being beamed directly into living rooms with constant updates have a role to play in making kind of unimaginable disaster seem very, very imaginable or realistic.
Back in Texas, the work continues. The shelters being constructed on this day, Lynch says, are headed to Nevada, North Dakota, and Georgia. But some are also destined for overseas. And while no bunker could survive a direct hit from a nuclear bomb, he says they can provide protection from the fallout.
You're going to have things like dust, pollen, bugs, everything else, like that in the air is going to be radioactive. So that's what you need protection from. The shelters will have an NBC air filtration system that'll filter out those particles.
These shelters are designed to last up to 150 years.
The hope, of course, is that bunkers like these will never have to be used, that diplomacy can triumph over disagreements, even between enemies. But it's the just-in-case scenarios that are keeping some American consumers worried enough to go underground. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Murchison, Texas.
Mali's ruling military says it's breaking defense ties with former colonial ruler France. Authorities have condemned what they say are flagrant violations of national sovereignty by French troops stationed in the country. It's the latest sign of deteriorating relations between France and Mali's military leaders, who seized power in 2020.
A ninth survivor has been found in Friday's building collapse in the Chinese city of Changsha. The woman is being treated in hospital after 3.5 days buried in the rubble. She repeatedly knocked on objects to send out signals. 14 more people are believed missing, with 2 people confirmed dead. 9 people, including the building's owner, have been arrested.
Muslims across India have been marking Eid al-Fitr by offering prayers outside mosques. These are the first mass celebrations of Eid in 2 years, with gatherings restricted during the pandemic. Eid marks the end of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, squeezing the olives for more than just food. Greece is harvesting its heritage.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in. Gas.
So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
within
the front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Greece is famous for its olive industry. It's the world's third biggest producer of the fruit and its oil.
And olives are also an attraction for tourists, with tastings, visits to presses and museums, all dedicated to them. As our correspondent Evangelos Tsipsas now reports, some olive presses are taking the experience to a whole new level.
When we think of Greece, we think of crystal clear waters, romantic sunsets, and delicious cuisine with fresh salads and some unique recipes. The key ingredient, of course, olive oil. About 100 kilometers southwest of Athens in the Peloponnese lies Markelos Olive Press. They have been here since the early 1930s, and ever since 2015 they have been exporting extra virgin olive oil to the world. Although the machines are off, since it's not harvesting season, the doors remain open, offering tours and tastings.
The first place I bring my guests is here to the olive grove. It's the first one to be owned by our family, and some trees are 500 years old. I explain to them the different types of olives we grow. We explain what we do during harvesting and how we protect the trees. Then they get a chance to touch and smell our trees and see where the olives come from. Then comes the fun part, the tasting. For that, we move indoors, where they also get to see how olive oil is made.
The term olive tourism was first used in Spain around 20 years ago. It then caught on in Greece, gaining popularity before the pandemic. As well as the presses and the tastings, there are spa and beauty treatments using olive oil-based products. But some are offering a more futuristic view of the industry. Although it's not harvesting season yet, wearing this virtual reality headset will give you the full experience, from being aboard a tractor to following workers pruning the trees. Let's give it a shot.
During lockdown, someone suggested making a virtual reality video. We thought it was a joke. We'd only seen it in video games. But we held on to the idea. And here we are a few months later, providing the first VR video of olive harvesting in Greece.
The pandemic forced many in the industry to shut down. But for those who survived, a government initiative offers hope and grants for olive press owners to help them rethink, recover, and open to the public.
So yes, we come in at this time where we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, where we have supported financially with subsidies and different kinds of loans the businesses so as to make do, so as to be able to survive. And now we're providing also those instruments or those means where they can be even more visible.
Greece is a fairly small nation with many olive oil varieties, each with its own unique taste. So besides the islands and the ancient monuments, sampling this liquid gold could be another one for the bucket list. Evangelos Tsipsas for CGTN, Corinth, Greece.
Chinese scientists are trying to set up a weather station on the world's highest peak.
Our correspondent Tao Yuan is following the expedition.
Setting out from base camp, destination, we were told, was just around the corner. But it was no walk in the park on these rocky trails more than 5,000 meters above sea level. For meteorologist Zhao Huabiao, it was a breeze.
Last year, I made a conscious decision to map my footprints and found between September and November, I walked about 300 kilometers.
Zhao studies the weather and climate on the Tibetan Plateau, a vast elevated area in western China that changes regional weather and feeds more than 10 of Asia's greatest rivers. It's also home to the world's tallest mountain, Chomolungma. The goal today is to install an automatic weather station at the foot of the mountain.
We're now 5,200 meters above sea level, and behind me is the majestic Mount Everest. We can see that scientists now are setting up a weather station here, and this is going to be the lowest altitude one in a series of weather stations that they're going to set up all the way to the mountaintop at 8,800 meters.
The machine measures wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, and solar radiation.
The Qinghai Tibet Plateau is the third pole. It's very high, and the temperature changes at different altitudes. Chomolungma is high even in this region. We study the evaluational gradient here so that we can better understand the entire third pole.
Back at base camp, we meet what's going to be the world's highest weather station. Specifically designed to be lighter, easier to assemble, it's going up to the summit of Chomolungma, 8,800 meters high, on the backs of experienced local Tibetan climbing guides.
This is our most special mission, to install a weather station 8,800 meters high. We must complete it fast so that the data can transmit back to the base camp and to the hands of scientists.
Braving fierce weather and low levels of oxygen, the team has already installed the second and third highest weather stations on the mountain. Zhao Huabiao heads a team at 7,000 meters high and is waiting for good news from above. Taoyuan, CGTN, at Chomolungma Base Camp.
Almost half a century after his death at the age of just 32, Bruce Lee's legacy lives on. The star of films like Enter the Dragon and Fist of Fury, he paved the way for movie martial artists like Jackie Chan and Jet Li.
Now, a new exhibition on the Kung Fu legend's career has opened in San Francisco's Chinatown. Our correspondent Mark New went along.
The Chinese Historical Society of America's We Are Bruce Lee exhibit is drawing in fans from across the globe who all hang on his every word.
No matter what life throws at you, no matter what adversity, just walk on.
Are you ready? I couldn't stop. Collector Jeff Chin loaned around 300 artifacts to the exhibit. Among them are items from the Green Hornet TV show that starred Bruce Lee as the Green Hornet's sidekick Kato. This document shows Lee was paid less than actors with minor roles and no more than the stuntmen. As a child, Chin says he was bullied so badly he developed an ulcer. But this poster of Bruce Lee kept him going.
I was crying, and it was almost like Bruce Lee was speaking to me. It's okay, Jeff, because I'm Chinese and I want you to be proud. So I told Bruce that if you help me out during this dark period of my life, I'm going to pay you back one day.
The museum exhibit also has interactive activities to get people involved and thinking. This one is called Fighting the Oppressor, Fear of Trying New Things. And here we go. Another angle on display is Bruce the thinker, philosopher, and writer.
He's very poetic, very spiritual, very articulate with his words, and he meant every word of it.
Museum Executive Director Justin Hoover takes us through a section that shows Bruce as a dancer and as an athlete, complete with his original workout schedules.
7 a.m. on Mondays, working on stomach and flexibility, running from 12 to 1.
What does he have secret here?
Secret?
Huh?
That's secret what he's doing then.
No, did he really?
Yeah, this is all original. Huh? You can't know what's in there, it's secret. Our exhibition here is to, see Bruce in those different ways, and then to show him beyond what people know him as, like the stereotypical Kung Fu master. He's beyond that. And then also, the goal is also to connect with the African American community. He was very powerful in how people could relate to him from any different background.
Bruce's first student and many others were black, a connection honored in an entire floor called the Underground.
We were invited to contribute to the story of Bruce Lee, and in particular to share in the love and affinity and respect that the black community, and then we expanded it to communities of color.
Visitors to the Underground are encouraged to share their favorite Bruce Lee philosophies.
Your favorite shirt? Oh, I love this shirt. That's me.
Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
The headlines again. The first evacuees from a steel factory in Mariupol have arrived in Ukrainian territory, but many more are still trapped.
Our other headlines: Boris Johnson becomes the first Western leader to address Ukraine's parliament, describing Kyiv's resistance as its finest hour.
And the European Union prepares fresh sanctions on Russia, but divisions remain over an oil embargo.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps: Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.